Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Maddie. In this video, I'm going to be going over the 17 books that I read in January. Reading is definitely not a race, but I do feel kind of astonished with myself that I read 17 books in 1 month. Now, some of these were audiobooks. And basically, I just decided in the new year, I just don't really like watching TV aside from the occasional trashy reality TV outlet such as Vanderpump Rules. I'm so excited it's back. I love The Real Housewives of Atlanta, and then I will occasionally watch The Challenge. But aside from that, TV has just not been calling to me. Books have been calling to me instead, which is why I have read so many this month. So let's go ahead and get into those 17 books that I read. I will leave chapters down below, so if you want to skip to any of the book reviews, go ahead. Again, these are just my opinions and what I think of them. If we have differing opinions, that's okay. The first book that I read in 2024 and in January was The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. Now, I am not a big romance reader. It just doesn't really fill my bucket. It's not something that I typically find very enjoyable. A lot of the times I just think it's cheesy. And I had figured that this book was going to be no exception, and I was wrong. This book, I don't know, it blew me away. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. Everyone had been talking about it, but I am a just born skeptic. So I just figured I wasn't going to love it like everyone else. And I really enjoyed this. This book follows our main character, Clementine. Clementine has recently been willed her aunt's apartment. Clementine knows that this apartment allegedly has like time travel powers, which just hearing that, I was like cringing, but it ended up making as much sense as it could and really propelling the plot forward. So Clementine's kind of experiencing a depression, a lull in her own life. She's in the publishing industry, but she's not really sure 100% if she wants to continue to climb up the corporate ladder or if this is really her calling. Plus, she's dealing with the loss of her aunt who she was really close with. So she's just feeling kind of stale. So she goes to her apartment one day, she opens it up, and she finds that there's a man there. This man's name is Ivan, and Clementine quickly realizes that he's from the past. He's from 7 years ago, and Clementine and Ivan, they get to know each other in the apartment. Ivan is an inspiring chef, and basically they have this like really beautiful love story, but he's Ivan of 7 years ago. So it's up to Clementine to decide, should she seek out Ivan of the present time, or should she just leave this in the past? And I thought it was going to be so cheesy, and it really isn't. I thought it was just so enjoyable. I really loved the banter between the two characters. I really loved the growth that they experienced together and separately, and I just thought that this was a really well-rounded romance story that didn't leave me like cringing or rolling my eyes. The second book that I read in January was The Nyx by Nathan Hill. This is advertised as an epic because it is like 600 or 700 pages. This took me like 2 weeks to read because of waning interest. So this book was an ambitious one. This was Nathan Hill's debut novel, and I see a lot of promise in his writing, but as for plot construction, it had a lot of issues. I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. This book follows our main character, Samuel. Samuel is currently a professor who's never really like lived up to his ambitions and to just kind of where his intellect should have led him. He has a book deal, but he hasn't been writing this book. And since Samuel was a teenager, he's been dealing with the loss of his mother. His mother abandoned Samuel and his father with like really no trace. She hasn't left anything behind. So as an adult, as this professor who's just drifting through life without really trying to better himself, Samuel comes across this new story that shows his mom, who abandoned him, throwing things at a state representative. I think it was the governor, and she becomes known as the Packer Attacker. So Samuel, seeing that his estranged mom, who literally abandoned him decades before, is now the Packer Attacker, he seizes this as an opportunity to finally write his book. He wants to write a tell-all about his mom and basically just kind of like light her up. So then it travels in the past. It tells you more about Samuel's mom. It tells you more about Samuel as a kid. And I think where Nathan Hill diverged and went a little south for me is not only did it tell you about their backstories, but it also began telling you about all of these random side characters. And I think that's something that a lot of newer authors do, is that they really want to create a world where everyone has a backstory and everyone has importance. And then it just becomes very bogged down with these people that have barely any relevance to the plot. Now I know like what they ate for lunch and their backstory, and I'm like, but they're not a character I should care about. And so this was kind of a slog to get through, and I didn't feel like the end payoff of why the mom left them and became the packer attacker, I just didn't feel like it was worth the read. The third book that I read was called Amazing Grace Adams. Again, this was another debut novel by the author Fran Littlewood. This was a read with Jenna pick, and I again was very disappointed with this novel. This follows our main character Grace Adams throughout different times in her life. It's told in past, present storylines. Grace is a very outspoken linguist. She translates a lot of text, and that's actually how she meets her soon-to-be future husband. In the present-day storyline, Grace is dealing with a fallout between her and her teenage daughter. In the past storyline, we see how Grace and her daughter came to heads and how Grace also lost her husband. And in the present storyline, it's basically Grace becoming more and more unhinged as she tries to travel to her daughter's birthday party. Her daughter doesn't want to see her, and you find out what happened between Grace and her daughter, and there's also another twist in there, and it just was too outlandish for me. I was on board probably the first 25% of this novel, and then it just became absolutely ridiculous, and Grace became really insufferable. You find out what happens between Grace and her daughter, and it's just, the reactions are just kind of nonsensical, which I get teenagers are nonsensical, but I just didn't like this. I didn't think it was worth the read. I ended up giving this 1.5 out of 5 stars. One of my goals for this year is to reread books that I remember enjoying and see if I still enjoy them in the present. The main way in which I am choosing to reread is through listening to the book on audiobook. So the first audiobook that I listened to this year was a reread, and this was Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. And I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed this just as much as I remembered enjoying it when I originally read it in 2020. This book is set in the 90s in the idyllic town of Shaker Heights. It primarily follows two families. We have the very picturesque, very blonde, blue-eyed nuclear family of the Richardsons. It's mom, dad, and then 4 of the siblings who are all born back to back to back. And then we have the newcomers in town who are renting a house from the Richardsons, Mia Warren and her daughter Pearl. Mia and Pearl have always been on the go. They live a more like bohemian, nomadic lifestyle. Mia is very free-spirited. She's an artist, and Pearl, her daughter, is very straight-laced. She's an academic. She does really well in school, and she's kind of always had the sense of not belonging because they're always moving. So when she encounters the Richardsons, she just falls in love with them. Mia's promised Pearl that this will be their forever home. Now, of course, if that was the whole plot of the story, it'd be a little bit boring, so there's more to it than that. In the town of Shaker Heights, which I described earlier as a very idyllic, very white town, there becomes a morality and race divide. The prior year, a Chinese immigrant overwhelmed. She leaves her baby behind at a fire station, and a white family ends up adopting this baby and basically like Americanizing the baby in just a year. And then the woman who abandoned her baby, Bibi Chow, she is now in a better headspace and she wants her baby back. And so there becomes this big lawsuit, there becomes this big racial divide, exposes secrets on all sides from the Richardson and also from Mia Warren because she's interwoven in there, and it really makes you think about where you would land morally, what is best for this baby. And I just absolutely loved this novel. I think it was better than the mini-series that they did on it, but honestly I thought the mini-series was pretty good as well. The next book that I read in January was called Ghosted. This is by Rosie Walsh, And to be quite frank, I thought I was reading a completely different book when I picked this up. I got this from my library, and I definitely thought that I was reading Ghosted, which is a book that Sarah Caroli recommends all the time about, like, I think it's like a single dad trope, and this was a different book. Have you ever done that before, where you thought you were getting one book and you ended up getting a completely different book? This story follows Sarah. Sarah meets this man named Eddie. Eddie and Sarah have like a phenomenal week together. They completely fall in love over this week. Sarah's going back and forth between the UK and the US, so Sarah has to go back to her life in the US, but her and Eddie leave on really good terms. Eddie's staying behind in the UK, and Eddie promises to keep in touch with Sarah, but he ghosts her. Sarah is determined to figure out why Eddie ghosted her, because she just doesn't believe that he would just maliciously do that to her. She has a feeling that there's something more to the story, and then it's up to her to piece together what happened to Eddie. Did something tragic happen? Did he find out a secret of Sarah's? And I just found this book to be incredibly boring. I ended up giving this 1.5 out of 5 stars. Nothing about this book was charming. The twist in the book was just silly. It didn't really make sense that these two characters wouldn't know these things about each other based on their past. And I didn't care for Sarah or Eddie. Next up, we have the first psychological drama thriller of the month. This is called All the Little Raindrops by Mia Sheridan. I picked this as my Amazon first read a few months ago, and then finally got around to looking at it. And quite honestly, had I done more research and pieced 2 and 2 together, I wouldn't have picked this. This is the same author as Archer's Voice, which I did not at all enjoy. I did end up enjoying All the Little Raindrops more than Archer's Voice, but not much. I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. Definitely look up trigger warnings before you read this book, because it's not graphic in what it describes, but it definitely does describe, in broader terms, sexual assault. This book primarily follows 2 characters, Noelle and Evan. Noelle and Evan have been taken from their hometown, and they are now bound up in a basement, locked in cages, and they're being rented out by people on the internet. Basically, people on the internet are watching these 2 from their computers, and these people that are watching them are like billionaires and millionaires. They have a lot of money to play around with, and then they rent Noelle and Evan out for whatever they want, sexual favors, for beatings. And Noelle and Evan actually know each other from their hometown. They have a tragic intertwining past, so it's up to Noelle and Evan to figure out how to escape this. There's also another character as well who is one of the people who's watching, but he has a lot of compassion, and he tries to intervene to help them escape. And you have to decide, is that character a good character, a bad character, or a morally gray character? And the first probably fourth of the book, I thought it was okay. And then something happened at the 50% mark that I just wanted to throw the book across the room. It was so cliched, and I just did not like this book. The next book that I read was a literary fiction book. This is called The Magician's Assistant. This is by Ann Patchett. This follows our main character, Sabine. Sabine was absolutely in love, absolutely enamored with a magician. His name was Parzival. Even though Parzival was a very openly gay man, Sabine attached herself and her identity into being Parzival's assistant. When Parzival ends up dying, Sabine's really caught off guard when she finds out that Parzival has an estranged family, 2 sisters and a mom who are still alive. Parzival had told her in the past that his family had died tragically, and so it's up to Sabine to decide if she wants to make contact with Parzival's estranged family. So Sabine ends up traveling to Parzival's hometown in Nebraska to meet his estranged family, and she finds out how they became estranged, what secrets Parzival's been hiding, and she just gets to know his little family. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it. It wasn't bad, it wasn't good, it was just kind of a slow burn. It was strange. I left this feeling kind of empty, and I also felt like it had a lot of Midwest cliches in it. like being dumb or being slow or being abusive, and that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And Patchett's writing so fluid, so I felt very conflicted on this rating. Next up, we have my second audiobook of the month. This is Finding Me by Viola Davis. I do not rate memoirs. I used to, and now in like retrospect, it just doesn't seem right to rate someone's life on a 5-star scale. So I'm basically just going to say either yes, check this out, or no, don't. And this is an emphatic yes, this is absolutely worth your time. Definitely recommend listening to this on audiobook. Not only because I think memoirs are more powerful on audiobook, but because Viola Davis's voice is just mesmerizing, which she actually acknowledges how strong and beautiful her own voice is in the audiobook narration. If you are not familiar with Viola Davis, I don't know where you've been. She's a phenomenal actress. She's been in the most recent Hunger Games. I knew her originally from How to Get Away with Murder, and just powerful. Even when we were watching the newest Hunger Games, my husband, who had never watched How to Get Away with Murder, he was like, who is that? She's awesome. She does such a good job of playing a creepy villain. And I was like, isn't she just wonderful? This follows Viola in her earliest days growing up in Rhode Island as one of the only Black families. Viola has a lot of siblings. They're very poor, and her parents are also in an abusive relationship. Viola and her siblings are frequent bedwetters, and they deal with the consequences of that and how cruel people were to her. I think that was one of the things that really stuck out to me, is no one ever intervened to really help them. Even the teachers were so cruel to Viola and her siblings, making them feel bad for coming to school smelly instead of trying to help them. So to watch Viola grow up and really come into herself was a really beautiful story, but it took a lot to get there, and at no point does Viola ever make herself or her siblings victims of their circumstance. She just tells it like it is. When Viola gets to the Hollywood portions of her memoir, she does such a phenomenal job of explaining colorism in Hollywood and how wrong it is. In fact, she talks about how she was nominated for an Emmy for one of her shows, and it's a show I've never heard of. It's because the show was primarily an all-Black cast, and a lot of times in Hollywood, if you're not a light-skinned Black person, you're seen as less than. You're seen as someone who's uncastable and just unattractive, and it's just so sad to read that. But she did such a great job of showing strength throughout all of these things that happened to her. The fact that she could forgive her dad for some of the things that he did to the family and to the mom, I mean, I was just very blown away with this memoir. Next up, I had my first 5-star read of the year. Little Fires Everywhere was a 5-star read, but this was the first like new to me book that was a 5-star read that I had no idea it was going to be a 5-star read when I opened it. This is called The Leavers by Lisa Coe. This was her debut novel, and she has another one coming out this year I'm so excited about. I randomly stumbled across this book in the Libby app under my library skip the loan section, and I just read the synopsis and just thought it'd be a good fit for me, and boy was I right. This book follows a young boy named Daming. Daming is being raised in New York City by his mom, who is a Chinese immigrant. Daming and his mom, they live with another Chinese immigrant family, and Daming is living a very normal life. He's going to a school where a lot of the kids are immigrants' kids, so he doesn't feel like an outcast. He very much so feels like he belongs. He loves being with his mom. He loves the other boy that he lives with, Michael. They're growing up basically as brothers, even though they're not actually blood related. And then one day his mom, Polly, just disappears. Unable to afford the cost of having Deeming, the other family that he's living with, they end up putting Deeming up for adoption, and he gets adopted by a white couple. They relocate him, and they try to Americanize him by changing his name to Daniel. So then we catch up with Deeming Daniel in the present day. He's now in his 20s. He has no idea what happened to his mom, Polly. He just thinks that she abandoned him and maybe went back to China, but he really has no idea, and he's really struggling in his 20s with his identity, with his purpose, with being the person that his adopted parents, Kay and Peter, want him to be, because they want him to be this academic person, and he really is only interested in music. And then in Daniel's identity crisis and coming into himself, we find out what happened to his mom. It tells the story in a past present timeline, and I just thought this was a really beautiful story about being an immigrant's child, about doing anything for your child. Just in general, Polly is such a strong character. She's so funny. I absolutely recommend The Leavers. The next book I read was the end of a trilogy. This is the Bill Hodges trilogy by Stephen King. This is the third installment, End of Watch. It's a very solid 3-star series. This follows Bill Hodges and his two sidekicks, Holly and Jerome, as they have to figure out if the original nemesis from the first book, Brady Hartsfield, is somehow back in action, even though he's brain dead. So it follows those three who you really fall in love with throughout the trilogy, and then we also learn that Bill has some health problems. Overall, I thought this was a very solid 3-star read. I think the Bill Hodges trilogy is just a really good 3-star read. For a detective novel, I think it has its charm, but there's a lot of plot holes. I definitely wouldn't consider it one of my favorite Stephen King novels or series, but it's definitely still enjoyable, and I wanted to read this before reading King's newest novel, Holly. Next up, we had another reread via audiobook. This was Where the Crawdads Sing. I read this at the height of Where the Crawdads Sing's mania when Reese Witherspoon first announced her book club, and I remember thinking that the story was very slow in the beginning, but I essentially ended up liking it. And I had the same feeling throughout. It was a little bit faster on audiobook, especially when you raise the speed, of course. This is a historical fiction novel. This is set in past present timelines in the 1950s and late 1969. In the present storyline, we find out that one of the prolific townspeople who comes from money in the town, Chase Andrews, he's been murdered. And then in the past timeline, we follow a little girl named Kaya. Kaya is our main character of the book. She comes from a Marsh family. They're just a very poor family who are looked down upon in their community because they live out on the marsh, kind of like a hillbilly-esque type of life. Kaya's mother abandons the family, and in turn, the other older siblings that Kaya has, they end up leaving as well because they don't want to deal with Kaya's abusive father. So at a very young age, we're talking like 5, 6 years old, Kaya has to learn to fend for herself, and she also doesn't want to really interact with the townspeople because they look down upon her. They call her the Marsh Girl, and Kaya at all costs refuses to go to school or even interact with them. And then, like I said, we're continuously going to the present storyline, finding out how Kaya ties into this Chase Andrews murder. And I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, but I had a lot of issues with this book. In particular, I think I was supposed to be more empathetic to Kaya, but I just found myself really annoyed with Kaya. I felt like she was very hypocritical, judging the townspeople as much as they were judging her. And so many times Kaya skittered away like a scared animal, which I know is the point, but it just was so frustrating. Also, there's one character in there who is so empathetic to Kaya, and then he does something so uncharacteristic to her that the author tried to make sense of, but it didn't feel authentic to that character to me at all. So I just felt like that was a huge disservice to the plot. I could feel the author moving the plot along by having the character do that, but it didn't make sense for the character to behave in that way. And the ultimate whodunit was dumb. 3 out of 5, but definitely doesn't deserve all of the hype I think it got. The next book that I read was my least favorite book of the entire month, and that was the Ex Hex by Erin Sterling. This was just bad. Again, romance, not my favorite, but this book has been on my TBR for about a year. I heard that it was just a cute little romance. You know, sometimes it's good to have those books in there where you don't really have to think all that much. You just get like pure joy, you have banter. This book was not it. Although you did not have to think much, the banter was terrible and just, it was dumb. This follows a witch named Vivian. Vivian was misled 9 years ago by a man who is also a witch named Reese. Basically, Reese and Vivian had a summer-long romance affair, and when it ended, Vivian and her cousin put a curse on Reese. They thought they were just being funny and just like making up a curse, but they actually ended up cursing Reese. So when Reese comes back 9 years later to their town, they notice that the magic in the town goes wonky, and Reese and Vivian have to work together to solve it, and of course they fall in love. Now, why I hated this book is because Reese and Vivian both had pretty much no personality. Reese's whole personality was the author saying that he was charming because he was Scottish and being good looking. Vivian's whole personality was being straight-laced and not really wanting much to do with magic. They had absolutely no chemistry. The magical world in the book didn't even make sense. So I did not like this book. I should have DNF'd it, but I forced myself to finish it, which I should not have done. And this is a solid 1 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was a young adult book. This is called Elsewhere by Gabrielle Zevin. I am currently trying to read the backlog of Gabrielle Zevin's books because I love Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow and the storied life of A.J. Fikry so much. And Zevin actually started in the young adult world before transitioning into literary fiction for adults. So this is one of her young adult books, and this was a really creative book. It's about the afterlife. Our main character, Liz, has been hit by a car while she was out riding her bike, and she's transported to Elsewhere, which is not quite heaven, not quite hell. It's just elsewhere. It's where you go whenever you die. I don't want to give too much away because that would detract from the world that Zevin built, but it's a really interesting look on what the afterlife could possibly be like. No part of it was really all that depressing. The only part that got me kind of emotional was when Liz was trying to communicate with her little brother on Earth, and that just made me kind of sad for the little brother. Overall, it definitely wasn't a depressive book. It was more whimsical, and it did a really good job of exploring what happens when you die to your family, what happens to you, why your outlook should be a certain way. The book did end up going in a direction that I didn't really love, probably about 50% in. It was an okay storyline, and then it did that thing where everything wraps up really nicely and neatly at the end, where everyone kind of like pairs off, which I just don't enjoy that in general when things are just too symmetrical and too idyllic. I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars because I still enjoyed it. I just thought that certain things were too perfect. The next book I read was a historical fiction book called Lady Tan's Circle of Women. This is by Lisa C. This takes place in 15th century China, and when I tell you that this story starts out with a bang, I mean it. Literally, the very first chapter, it describes in extensive detail the process of foot binding, which I had always known about, but I don't think I ever really thought about what that entails, hence like the broken bones and having to wrap it and the infections. So if you are easily squeamish and grossed out, this may not be the book for you because it does describe a lot of medical things that are just, for lack of a better word, gruesome and gross, but that's how they did things in the 1400s. This book did a really great job of authentically exploring class divides, gender inequality, how the dynasty was run. But I think where I really didn't connect with the book is it read like the author had done a lot of research, which is great, but it didn't really read like the characters were real people. In particular, the main character, I just never connected to her or really felt all that much empathy towards her. I just felt like she was very wooden. And I think if this would have had a stronger protagonist, someone with a little bit more of a personality instead of just kind of like watching things and then seeking others to help her respond, I think this could have been very easily a 5 out of 5 star read, but because I never really felt that personal connection to any of the characters, I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. The last audiobook that I listened to this month was another memoir. This was Minka Kelly's Tell Me Everything. Honestly, I didn't really know much about Minka Kelly before listening to this book. All I really knew about her is that she was on Friday Night Lights and that she dated Derek Jeter. And wow, when I tell you that this is one of my favorite celebrity memoirs I've ever listened to, like, I very sincerely mean it. And I think I really connected to this because Minka Kelly is such a survivor. She grew up in such an unstable household with a mom who clearly did love her but could not prioritize her. And as a former educator, unfortunately, I see those type of situations a lot. And so I just had so much empathy towards Minka, and I so many times I wanted to jump through the pages and just give little Minka a hug and let her know that what was happening to her wasn't her fault. There's one scene where Minka's mom's friend, Claudia, has had enough of the mom's antics and kicks Minka and her mom out of her house. And Minka's banging on the door saying, "I promise I'll be better, Claudia. I promise I'll be better," when none of it is Minka's fault. Like, I was heartbroken for her. And then it was heartbreaking to watch her fall down the pattern of choosing men over her friends and over women in her life because that's all she knew, that's all she grew up with. I found that just heartbreaking, and I really hope that Minka Kelly has broken that cycle within herself. I also found it really inspiring and really aspirational that even without acting, she made so much more of her life than what probably a lot of people would have projected for her. I didn't realize that she was a scrub nurse before even getting into modeling or acting or being on Friday Night Lights. And so I have the utmost respect for Minka Kelly. She just seems like she's such a genuinely sweet person who was dealt a really, really tough hand and did the best that she could to stabilize herself and stabilize her life. If you're looking for a celebrity memoir that really focuses on, giving you celebrity tea or celebrity drama, Minka Kelly's memoir is not that. Most of it focuses on her life before becoming a celebrity. And as someone who does like the celebrity tea, I didn't find that to be a turnoff in the slightest. I found her early life to be more interesting than what she revealed from her celebrity life. And I think that she could really stand on her own just without being celebrity in the memoir space. The 16th book that I read this month was really good, actually, by Monica Heisey, and I think this book has the most insufferable main character I've ever had to read about. This follows our main character, Maggie. Maggie is 29 years old and newly divorced. Because Maggie is so young and has spent so much of her time since she was 19 years old with her now ex-husband, or soon-to-be ex-husband, I should really say, she just feels like she's a failure. It's embarrassing for her to go up to people and say, "I'm 29 years old and I'm divorced." So that was an accurate depiction of how someone would feel if they were 29 years old and divorced. They literally got married and then they were paying for the divorce with the money that they got from their wedding as wedding presents. So I thought that it was a good concept, but the main character, Maggie, was just completely unhinged. She was so insufferable. The fact that she even had friends was astonishing. I don't know how they put up with her. I don't know why they forgave her, because she was so selfish through the entire book. And there were times when I laughed at some of the things she said and some of the things she did. But overall, I just felt like the author was trying too hard. Like, she would do lists a lot of the times to open the chapter, like Maggie's recent Google searches, and the list would just go on for so long. I was like, we get it. She's annoying and depressed. I think I spent a lot of the time comparing this to Dolly Alderton's Ghost, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. I gave that one 4 out of 5 stars, which was a similar-ish concept of being with someone for a really long time, being in your early 30s, late 20s, and kind of having to rearrange your life while also feeling kind of like you're behind your peers and behind on a timeline. I just felt like it just didn't even come close to the humor and the wit and the insight that Alderton provided in Ghost. I just felt like this was just, for lack of a better word, a bitch session from our main character. and I didn't really find any redeeming qualities about Maggie. And the last book that I read was a thriller. This was the only one left by Riley Sager. The only one left is Riley Sager's newest thriller. I've seen a lot of people talking about it. This takes place in the 80s. This follows our main character, Kit. Kit is a home health aide, and Kit has recently been disparaged and dragged through the media for allegedly killing one of her patients. They couldn't find enough evidence to convict her on that, but basically her reputation is ruined. Having run out of money and just being really uncomfortable around her father because her father thinks she's guilty of killing someone, Kit accepts a less than desirable job at an accused killer's mansion. Our accused killer's name is Lenora. Lenora had a stroke and now she is unable to communicate and she's unable to move, I think, on her entire left side. And so it's up to Kit to take care of her. Kit's kind of uncomfortable at this creepy mansion because everyone thinks that in the 1920s, Lenora killed her parents and sister. Again, wasn't enough evidence to convict her, but basically the public opinion convicted her and everyone thinks that she did this horrible thing. So even though Lenora is immobile and can't speak, Kit's still pretty uncomfortable going over there, but it's really her only job prospect. Lenora lets on that she can type on the typewriter, and she types out that she wants to tell Kit the entire story of what happened the night that her parents and her sister were murdered. And Kit has to decide, am I going to trust Lenora? Am I going to help her? Am I scared that she's going to do something to me once I find out what happened that night? And honestly, I thought this book was really repetitive and really slow paced, but something about it, I did want to know what happened. So something about it was compelling. It was a solid 2.5 out of 5 stars until I got to the last 70% of the book. That's when a gigantic plot hole came into play. It was like twist after twist after twist, and none of them made sense. The last page, the last chapter, the epilogue, and the last little page was some of the most ridiculous things I've ever read in my entire life. And this became a 1 out of 5. Just like that. It went. That is absolutely everything I read in January. Leave me a comment down below. What was the best thing that you read in January? What was the worst thing that you read in January? Did you read any of the books that I read? Do you agree? Do you disagree? That's what makes this fun, the discourse. I will link my Goodreads down below if you want to follow me. If you did enjoy this video, please do make sure that you give it a thumbs up and you hit the subscribe button. I will see you guys next time. Bye!